Okay, picture this, a brand new nation, finally free, standing at this massive crossroads. We're talking 1947, India's independent, and the single biggest question is, what now? What kind of country are we actually going to build? The air is just electric with all these different competing ideas for the future. So today, we're going to dive into one of the most fascinating of those visions, a powerful idea for a third way that tried to carve its own unique path right between the two big giants.
So here's what we've got lined up. First, we'll look at the huge choice India was facing right after independence. Then, we'll get into how the Socialist Party came to be. And spoiler alert, it wasn't some imported idea. It grew right out of the freedom struggle. After that, we'll break down their vision for a third way, meet some of the key people behind it, and finally, see how an idea can actually outlive the party that started it. It's a great story.
All right, so let's set the scene. It's the late 1940s. The dust from partition is still settling, and you've basically got two major paths emerging. And these weren't just political choices, they were two totally different roadmaps for the very soul of India.
So, on one side, you had the Congress Party. Their plan? A mixed economy. Gradual, steady change. Think evolution, not revolution. But then, on the other side, you had the Communist Party. They were all about Marxist ideals, calling for a complete, radical overthrow of the old systems. So, yeah, the choice seemed pretty black and white.
But that's the big question, right? Were those the only two options on the table? A kind of moderate, mixed economy path, or a full-on, violent revolution? A lot of people were thinking, no way, there has to be another option, a third way.
And that right there is where our story really kicks off. Because the answer to that question came from a group whose ideas weren't just borrowed from somewhere else. Nope, they were forged in the fire of India's own independence movement. This was not a copy-paste ideology. This was 100% homegrown. So you can see here, the party's journey was, well, it was complicated. They actually started out way back in 1934 as a socialist group inside the Indian National Congress. But then, by 1948, Congress basically said, you're either with us or you're out, forcing them to break away and form their own separate Socialist Party. And here's the real twist. Just a few years later, in 1955, Congress itself decides to adopt a socialist pattern of society. Can you imagine? It kind of pulled the rug out from under the socialists and created a massive identity crisis for them.
So this really forced their hand. They had to get crystal clear about what exactly they stood for. Their whole identity, their entire reason for being, was built on offering a truly distinct alternative, this third way that wasn't capitalist and wasn't communist.
And at the absolute heart of their vision was this idea: democratic socialism. What does that even mean? Well, think of it like this. They wanted the best of both worlds. They looked at communism and said, okay, that economic equality part, we like that. But they absolutely refused to sacrifice the political freedoms and the individual rights that, Indians had just fought a massive struggle to win. It was all about finding that balance.
This really lays it all out. What did they say no to? Well, capitalism, for one. They saw it as a system that just made the rich richer. And they also said a hard no to communism because they rejected its violence and its dictatorial nature. So what did they say yes to? They advocated for a strong welfare state, protecting workers, making sure everyone has access to education and healthcare. And crucially, they wanted to strengthen democracy from the ground up, giving more power to the people.
So this wasn't just talk, they had a real game plan. What was on the checklist? Protect the interests of workers and peasants. Check. Create a welfare state with education, healthcare, jobs. Check. Reduce that huge gap between the rich and the poor. Absolutely. And strengthen democracy by getting citizens more involved. They had this vision of a classless society. But, and this is the key part, they wanted to get there through peaceful, democratic means. No violence.
Now, it's one thing to have these grand ideas on paper, but this was a real movement, driven by some of the most brilliant and passionate thinkers of that era. These were the people who gave this vision a voice.
And wow, what a lineup. The movement had some serious intellectual heavyweights. You had leaders like Acharya Narendra Dev, who was kind of the moral and ethical compass of the whole thing. Then there was Jayaprakash Narayan, JP, who famously called for a total revolution, but a peaceful one, by empowering people at the grassroots level. And you absolutely cannot forget the fiery Dr. Rammanohar Lohia. He was a fierce critic of Nehru and argued that you couldn't have real socialism without tackling the deep-rooted injustices of caste and gender. I mean, these weren't just politicians, they were true visionaries.
Okay, so with all this incredible intellectual firepower, you'd think they'd be unstoppable, right? But the Socialist Party itself, Well, it didn't last. At least, not in its original form. They really struggled to turn those powerful ideas into votes. They were often just overshadowed by the massive political machine of Nehru's Congress. But, and this is maybe the most important part of the whole story, the idea itself, the idea of Indian socialism, that turned out to be way more resilient than the party.
So what actually happened? Well, the original party eventually fragmented. It kind of splintered into several new groups, like the Praja Socialist Party and the Samyukta Socialist Party. But here's the thing, it wasn't really an end. It was more like a dispersal. Imagine a river splitting into many streams. The core ideology didn't just vanish, it flowed into these new political parties, carried forward by its believers.
And this is why this whole story is so relevant today. The political DNA of that original socialist movement, it's still alive and kicking. You can find its roots in some of India's major modern parties. We're talking about the Samajwadi Party, the Rashtriya Janata Dal, the Janata Dal United, and the Janata Dal Secular. All of them can trace their ideological family tree right back to this quest for a third way.
So when you boil it all down, this is the formula they were fighting for. It's a simple equation, but it's incredibly powerful. Equality plus democracy plus justice. For them, that equaled true socialism. It was about bringing all three of those crucial elements together.
And that really leaves us with one last big question to chew on. You know, when we look around at the world today, with its deep inequalities and the real threats to democracy we're seeing everywhere, you gotta wonder, is that quest for a third way, a path that's both humane and democratic, that isn't just pure capitalism or pure authoritarianism, is that idea more relevant now than it's ever been? Definitely something to think about.